So thank you both for coming here today. I really appreciate the time. Today we're just hoping to have a conversation about your journeys into this world of curling. And I'd like to start by having you tell a little bit of the story of who you are. I think too often we focus on your roles and responsibilities and your professional careers, but I'd like to know a little bit more about you two and what brings you here today. So Roselle, how about we start with you?
Oh, thank you. It's a thick question. Thank you for having me. And I'm always excited to talk about curling and the stories that we have around it, but I never get to talk about who I am. So I'm excited. I don't know that it has very much to do with curling. But first and foremost, I'm an immigrant woman. I'm an immigrant settler here on Indigenous land. And I moved to Canada when I was 13 from India. And that, created for me a real moment in my own development as an adolescent, in recognizing that my skin had gone from something that was part of the homogenous whole in the place where I grew up to a place now where all of a sudden, in relation to people around me, my skin had a different connotation. And so I became racialized in a very sort of conscious way. I remember the moments. I remember realizing that there was something different about me, being curious, wanting to explore and dig into things, decided I really want to understand why that is a thing. Like, why is my skin color different than somebody else? Not just in the fact that they're different skin tones, but in the power that they seem to hold and the value that they seem to hold in our society. And so, I went to school thinking I'd learn about psychology, quickly realized I don't care about other people's problems. But I did go on to study the neural underpinnings for why our brains work the way that they do. How do we, pin those biases or ways of understanding? And the further I got into academia, the more I realized that in order for me to understand the world around me, I would have to do a little bit of digging into my understanding of myself. And my doctorate, which is, I completed it just up the road at the University of Calgary, was an exploration of identity, particularly intersectional identity. How do we create community here now that we're all sort of from different places and have different stories? And, the last 10 years of my career have been committed to the conversation of sitting with one another's stories. Fundamentally, to me, that is what inclusion work really is the opportunity to sit with one another, listen to each other's stories, create that empathy with one another, and then utilize that opportunity to network and create a system where inclusion is at the heart of it. Because too often we think about, the differences between us as individual. And what I have found both in my career, in my education, and my lived experience is that more often than not, there are systems at play that we don't always have a line of sight to and we don't always acknowledge. And so that's, sort of the personal to professional journey. And then about 5 or so, actually it was pre-COVID, it was maybe 2017, 2018, living in Calgary, I decided I wanted to take up a winter sport, and I had a friend say, hey, want to try out curling? And the rest is sort of history, and I've been on the board with much gratitude for the last 2 or 3 years, and had the opportunity to serve, and I'd love to get into more of that with you.
Great, thank you. Michael, how about yourself?
So I'll start by sharing that when you said we wanted to have a conversation about curling, I was very excited. When you opened with, let's talk about you, I had a moment of panic. So I'm not as prepared for this part of the discussion as I thought I would be. My journey through life has led me to understand that at my core, what's really important to me is growth and experience and learning. And the most important thing about me, if you want to know me, the most important thing is I thrive in an environment where I can be part of a team and help a team achieve something together that we couldn't apart. That's what I'm all about. So family is very important to me for that reason. Community is very important to me. And curling is, because I feel like that's what my journey has all been about, is about contributing and being part of a group to achieve things together. My path to the board probably couldn't be more different than Roselle's. I think we represent a full range of possibilities. As an Indigenous person, I have roots in the country that go back countless generations. But even at my own club, my home club, we have 5 generations that have played there, right? So we have that very deep part of of who I am is grounded in curling. And curling is definitely the through line that runs through everything I've done. I started the game playing with my grandfather and playing with my parents. I met my wife through curling. I've competed with both my children and now their partners, and share the ice with my grandchildren now. So it's it's that core of when I think about my life, it all goes through curling. So it's brought me all the joy that I have, and all the challenges that I seek, and all the opportunities I'm looking for.
Amazing. One of the reasons I wanted to sit down with both of you is for exactly that reason, that I feel within the broader scope of curling, there are stories about racialized or Indigenous people that perhaps have just not been raised to the same level as some of the other stories. We all love the high performance athletes that are doing an amazing job in the backdrop of the Scotties here today, and we see that. But equally as important are all these different kinds of stories that come here, and we all have these interesting connections into curling, whether it's from a friend, whether it goes back generations. So I really appreciate you starting off with that. Which leads into the sort of the next part of this, that perhaps curling does not necessarily reflect the broader demographics of Canada, and so part of the reason that we're all here today is to sort of talk and unpack some of those kinds of questions. So from your perspective, I was wondering if you might be able to talk about what you see as sort of the gap or the challenge for people who are, say, quote unquote, non-traditional curlers to be part of this wonderful community. Who wants to take it?
It's really curious to me. When I found out about curling as a sport, well into being an adult, it occurred to me that I had never heard about it in my, years of being an adolescent or teenager or my early 20s living in Southern Ontario. Not because curling doesn't exist. Of course curling exists in Southern Ontario. But one, my family was new immigrants. All of my friends were from families that were new immigrants. Most of us came from places where ice was not a thing, right? I remember the first time I encountered snow. I was really surprised that it's wet, and disappointed a little.
Yeah.
The notion of my parents choosing to put me into an extracurricular where they might have to step onto ice, not a thing we would conceive of, was so far outside our comfort zones that, we played soccer in the summertime, indoor sports, we played bowling, all kinds of things that didn't have to involve us standing on ice, because to us, ice seemed dangerous, right? And so as an adolescent, I didn't have exposure to a curling rink. I didn't have exposure to the fact that this was an incredible community of folks. What I've realized in the years since I've been a part of the curling, ecosystem, is that for me, it has been an incredibly welcoming space for more or less parts. And yet, representation of me being in those spaces is not the end of that statement, because it's not enough for me to be the first and the only. In some ways, our curling ecosystem does a really fantastic job of having a really beautiful open door policy. Everybody is welcome. What we forget about sometimes is that not everybody knows that there's a door to approach. Not everybody knows how to approach that door, what the road getting there is. And so sometimes the gap is less about what's inside our system and more about what are the alleyways and pathways that allow people to access our system in equitable ways, in ways that allow for their journey to matter in how they show up to those curling systems. Yeah.
Great.
So Roselle, you jumped in on a story I was going to tell.
Sorry.
I first heard Roselle's open door analogy when Roselle first ran for the board. It turned out I happened to be chairing the nominations committee, so we had a lot of discussions about this very question. And she shared with me, the story about the recognition that in the system we talk to a lot of people who believe we have an open door policy, but that's not enough. Right? Sometimes you have to show people the door. Sometimes you have to take their hand and walk them through the door. When they're entering a place that doesn't feel like it's representative of themselves. where it feels like a place that they don't belong, you have to take that extra step. So for me, one of the things I've come to realize is that one of the gaps and challenges we have is what we're talking about in curling right now is trying to preserve the core but stimulate growth. We're trying to preserve everything we've been and our history and our traditions and our values and everything we love about the sport. We want to preserve that. But at the same time, we know we have to grow and change. For those of us that have deep roots in the system, we tend to fall to preserving the core and not willing to make enough space for that growth. So I think one of the problems that we have is we believe we have an open door and we believe that's enough. But we have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable and realizing that if we want curling to look inside the sport the way it looks outside in Canada, we're going to have to be willing to ask some uncomfortable questions and to do some things differently.
If I can jump in there. So I did mention that I, was a nerd for a moment and learned all this brain stuff. So I'm going to apply it a little bit here. But our brains, our ancient brains, don't really know the difference between our fear that's rooted in something uncomfortable and fear that's rooted in something that may be unsafe, right? Those really ancient parts of our brain are trying to keep us safe from weather conditions, from saber-toothed tigers, what have you. But we haven't evolved fast enough to realize that we have the same feelings when we're uncomfortable. And so I hold a lot of sort of compassion for those uncomfortable spaces of growth where folks who are committed to, keeping the core intact might be feeling. It's never comfortable to grow. It's never comfortable to feel like you might be out of sync with the world as it's evolving around you. And so that fear is really a protective mechanism. I think for Curling Canada, for us as we, manage to have these conversations of balancing the preservation with the promise of growth and the promise of reflecting a broader whole, I think it's that ability or building that muscle memory to be uncomfortable, knowing that it is still safe, knowing that 5 generations of Szajewskis will still be at the curling rink and that there are core traditions that will be a part of curling going forward. And there is room enough for a wider variety of folks to find their next 5 generations in those rinks. So I really value that it's not an either or, it's a both and.
That's great.
I love working with Roselle because she takes these notions and nuggets of things that I drop and turns them into a coherent thought.
You're very
so I appreciate that.
And she's very good at last names, apparently.
Yes.
So one of the things that I think we get a little bit, let's say, tunnel vision when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you both have 2 unique experiences coming into the game. You're also on a board level. You're connected with Curling Canada. And I'd like to sort of just ask you, what do you see as the good, right? What are those sort of things that maybe come to mind that it's like, oh wow, I can see that this is a really good thing, a little bit of progress, whatever that means to you. I'm just wondering, I think that we forget that there is good in this as well. So who wants to take that? Michael?
So I'm going to answer the question initially from a broader sense, from a global sense. Curling is in a really good space in a lot of areas. The product on the ice, the athletes are phenomenal. The game is better than it's ever been, and the global reach is broader than it's ever been. On World Curling, we're more than 60 countries that are represented now. The appeal to the sport internationally is at an all-time high. The ability to consume the sport has grown exponentially, right? When I grew up, if you wanted to see curling, you watched it on Saturday afternoon. There was a TV show that was highlights, right? Now we've got the great work that our broadcasters are doing, but we're also seeing a tremendous amount of content available through streaming. So the ability for fans to engage with the sport and to learn about it and understand it is at an all-time high. Excuse me. When Roselle talked about her experience and coming to Canada as a new Canadian and experiencing curling for the first time and understanding the concept of a game played on ice, as we move forward, it's more likely that a new Canadian will have some connection to curling when they arrive. They will have been exposed to it, will have an emotional connection to it. So I think that, I think the popularity of the sport, the growth of the sport, and the perception of the athletes has changed dramatically over the last few years, and I think that sets us up really well.
That's great.
Yeah, well, I mean, not to date myself, but I don't think I'd call myself a new Canadian anymore. I'm 26 years into my life here. But I certainly, remember that. And what has changed in the quarter century since my experience was true is that because of the, global tech sort of explosion to watch curling whenever, wherever, there are now teams in India, there are teams in Pakistan, there are teams across countries that would not have had exposure. And I have friends who curl at the national level in India now, who curl at the national level in Pakistan. And what is so cool to me is that the thing that is really powerful about the core of curling is its commitment to community and its commitment to good relationships. And I think that spans our ecosystem in Canada, it spans our position within the global curling ecosystem, and you see it when you meet with folks across the world, when you meet with folks across the country, people wanting to be able to harness the power of that community. I've watched, even in the short time that I've been a part of the governance of Curling Canada, the conversation around inclusion not just as something tokenized or something programmatic, but as something that's systemic, that's something that every single person has the opportunity to have a hand in, has shifted and changed. And what that really means is that it's no longer one or two voices asking for it in isolation. It's a recognition systemically to say, we have something really awesome here, and we have the opportunity to build better and do better with, folks who are coming in, who are new, but also folks around the world. One of the really cool things that I had the opportunity to chat about a little while ago was curling as an ambassadorial program to the rest of the world. We know that Canada's, population growth over the next 10 years is primarily driven by immigrants. And those immigrants are watching curling on television, they're watching the Olympics, they're getting excited about it. And Canada is the world's curling community. They want to be a part of this really cool, fantastic thing we have. What a fantastic way to say, welcome to Canada. We curl here, right? And that's something that we know our reputation precedes us across the globe. And we know that reputation has some really fantastic ramifications for integrating our new Canadian communities into feeling a sense of belonging, into feeling that sense of community that we value so much in curling.
Yeah, I think it's amazing that you bring in, both of you are talking about community and how important the community of curling is to the sport. And from my perspective, is one of the reasons that I was so attracted to curling, and that I went off and wrote a PhD about it, because it is actually the social connections that I found were profound. I have not found them in any other sport. I mean, there's no way that I'm going to share a beer, after a soccer game with my opposing team. It just doesn't happen. You're also part of a smaller community, which is the Board of Governors. And I was wondering, what has that meant to you, being part of that small community? I'm not even sure probably a lot of people within the curling community really understand what you're trying to accomplish and what you do as board members. So I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about what your role is and what you're trying to accomplish at that board level.
Your turn first.
Well, the value of good governance in an ecosystem like curling, where you've got, on the ground grassroots community, you've got high performance on the podium community, you've got Curling Canada doing an incredible job of operationalizing, you've got our, member associations across the provinces and territories, really holding those ecosystems together. The network, the map of those is a beautiful thing to watch. And so the benefit of sort of sitting with our Board of Governors comes with an immense degree of responsibility to recognize that the governance of our Curling Canada system allows for the smoother operations of all of those jurisdictions that sort of network into it. Good governance isn't necessarily, getting into the weeds and getting into the operations and micromanaging, but it is entrusting our system to amplify the values that we hope to permeate through that ecosystem. It is creating trust with our stakeholders so that we know that we're in alignment for the benefit of Curling Canada and the curling system across the country. The underpinnings of good governance mean that we are able to have really meaningful conversations that aren't always easy, but it is important to have uncomfortable conversations for the benefit of a greater whole, for that greater good, in order for the next 50 years, the next 100 years of curling to be just as powerful as a vehicle for social change and social good relations. We at the governance table need to be able to have those conversations in a way that is values driven and recognizes that we are not speaking for the moment, we're speaking for a much broader whole that we don't always have a line of sight to in the present.
Wow.
So picking up on a couple of those thoughts, I think what's important to understand about governance is that our role is largely strategic. We're about putting together a strategic plan for over the next 3, 4, 5 years. What does the sport look like? But I think the real value that we bring as a board, we are a risk-based, values-led board, right? So you think of the tension between those two statements.
Yeah.
Part of what we can do is provide insight into risks that we see, but also tie back our decision-making and what we're doing and how we approach our business from the values that we've already established. So I think being arm's length out of the fray, being able to provide that sort of insight back to the plan is an important part of what we can do as governors.
Very interesting. So I think it's appropriate. We have an interesting backdrop here. There's a lot of young people on the ice today. Wanted to talk a little bit about the future that you see about curling. From a whole different kinds of perspectives. You're talking about risks, talking also about the idea that we want to extend a different kind of welcome to our whole community and bring them into the sport. What do you see in the future of curling related to those kind of components?
I can point to a couple of things that are happening right now that give me hope for what a future for curling looks like. I think everybody can agree about, the kiddos playing curling being a fantastic thing. You watch the joy, you watch the hooping and hollering, the competition, that sense of pride. I can't remember his name, but there was a baron in France in the 1800s who talked about not curling, but sport being a human right.
Yeah.
The idea that sport is actually a vehicle to communal strength and communal healing and communal opportunity. And I see curling as that opportunity, that vehicle for social change, for social engagement, for feeling that sense of belonging, for feeling that sense of empowerment. There are communities across our provinces and territories right now that are engaging, for instance, Indigenous communities, so that we can get curling into schools where kids do not always have the opportunity for sport, because we know that curling isn't a high financial input kind of sport. You can do it, with a few different resources. There's input that can be done through community. And so that that invitation point is much lower in those barriers to access. And so, my home province of Nova Scotia right now, we're working across the province with every single Indigenous community in Mi'kmaq to recognize that children's access to this sport is one of the most powerful ways in which we can say, hey, we have something cool around community building. And we also recognize that we haven't always done a good job of saying, hey, this is where the door is. Come on in. I've been here in Alberta for many years as well, and worked up north with a number of Indigenous communities there to bring together, this past spring we brought together like 500 young people, put them into curling rings, introduce them to the rules, and to watch the ways in which sport transforms the well-being of young people. It's an infusion of energy, both for the kids, but also really for those of us who have hope for a future in which curling continues to act as that vehicle for growth and change.
So that's probably the biggest question you've asked so far. You know, I think I'll speak a little bit to what I hope the future looks like and what I'm working towards and what I think we should all strive for. And it's coming back to preserving the core but stimulating growth, right? So I hope those things we love about the sport, the community aspect of it, the notion that it's a game that we shake hands before and after, right? That you don't celebrate when the other team misses a shot, right? The respect for the competition and for each other in that community. I hope that we can preserve all of that, and that maintains part of what the curling experience is in Canada. I hope that curling remains as part of the quintessential Canadian experience, right? That we identify the Canadian culture as a tie to curling. I hope that we preserve all of that, but I also hope the sport looks very different. I hope that the way people play in clubs is different. I hope that we evolve the sport to meet the demands of our new consumers. Bobby Ray, who's curling club manager for Curling Development Manager for Curling Canada, put out a post on one of the social channels a few months ago, and I've put it on my desk, and it's my background now to my computer, because to me it speaks so much about what we need to do in the future, and that is that we don't have a problem with the popularity of curling. We have a problem with the delivery mechanism. So I hope that we can change that. I hope that we can find a way to deliver the opportunity for people to enjoy the community in a way that is relevant to Canadians today.
And just sort of to follow up on that same idea, for those outside the sport, or think of it, somebody coming for the first time, and you're trying to explain why curling, why you should become and be part of the sport. I'm wondering if you could share some thoughts just about that.
Can we take it again? I grew up in a high performance sports family, and for the most part, after your early childhood, right up until adolescence, right after that, we see a sharp decline in involvement in sports, and more often than not, we also see a much sharper decline across gender lines. And so, 1 in 3 girls, for example, by the age of 12 drops out of sport completely. The other 2 probably, a few years down the road, very few make it into adulthood or to high performance. What curling is really unique in is how incredibly equitable and accessible it is, regardless of age group, regardless of gender, regardless of ability. There are ways in which we have created entry points that are accessible so that the sport of curling, the spirit of curling, continues to remain at the core of that, regardless of who you are and how you've come to that sport. If you need a wheelchair, if you need a support mechanism, if you are a man, a woman, someone who's non-binary on the spectrum of gender, if you are in your 80s and 90s versus if you are, a 3-year-old using that support structure. I think that unique ability to be a sport, regardless of what the rest of the world sometimes sees as barriers to entry, is one of the most powerful things that we have to offer. And I wish that were the thing we used as our calling card to say, not just everyone is welcome here, but we have built this with you in mind. We have built this system acknowledging that there is a diversity of human experience, and with all that diversity, you are still a curler. And that to me is the most powerful calling card for us.
Yeah, this is another one of those difficult questions for me, because when you ask me why someone should be involved in the sport, when I think of all the joy I've gotten from curling, when I think of all the great people I've met, the people in this room and the conversation we're having, and when I think about everything it's brought me, my response to that question is, why wouldn't everybody? Right? It's not why would you, it's why wouldn't you? But I will share this. Today's my father's 85th birthday, and he's been a member of our club in Keewatin for 70 years. I still play one night a week with him in men's league, and next week I'm competing with my son in a curling club championship. And last week I was on the ice with my grandson for a half hour while we were out throwing rocks. So that's my answer. right? Why wouldn't you want that experience? Why don't we want everyone to have that opportunity? So it speaks to community, it speaks to family, and it speaks to joy.
Wow, it's beautiful. Listen, I really appreciate both of your time today. We've covered a lot of ground. I'm just wondering if you have any sort of closing thoughts about, we've talked a lot about, the role of diversity, equity, and inclusion in this sport, your roles today. Just some final closing thoughts about, this world of curling that we're in and, moving into a next generation. What are your thoughts on that? You could just talk about joy again, Michael. That was perfect.
My closing thoughts on the discussion are that my hope is that we have the will to make the changes we need to make. That we, at all levels of this system, whether it's the board or whether it's at a local curling club, have the will to get uncomfortable, to ask difficult questions. That we look at our membership inside the building, and here I am. I'm talking about membership in clubs, and I'm tying back to my legacy of curling, right? I should be talking about facilities and participants. But when we look at those people that are inside our club, that if they don't look like the people in our community, that we recognize we have work to do. That if we don't have someone on our boards who's under 40, we have work to do. If we don't have gender parity on our boards, there's work to do. That if we don't have a youth program and an adult learn to curl program in our clubs, that we have work to do, and that we have the willingness to do those things. Because we've talked about the future and what we want it to look like, and that's the pathway, is being willing to do the hard work.
I think you took it. No. I don't share Michael's legacy of curling. I came to the sport late, and I came to service in the sport late as well. But something that has been core to my own journey in life has been, how can I help? How can I contribute of what I have as a skill set or a gift to the world that is around me? I do not believe that we create community in isolation. Like, me holding the flag and saying, I'm creating community here, right? You create community by asking the question of, what does the world around me need? And then contributing of those skill sets. And so for anybody who is outside of the ecosystem of curling, I would encourage a query of, how do I see myself contributing to this? If I want to make it a place where I can belong, do I go and join a club? Do I go and maybe do some service work? Do I join a board or a community league or a community conversation around leadership or whatever it might be? There are 1,000 different ways in which people can become involved when we start to ask the question of, how do I serve? How do I help? How do I create an opportunity to contribute? What I would also say to the wider curling community then in that case is to recognize that there are many different ways in which we can invite folks into our ecosystem. Mike mentioned that a board without, balance, whether it be gender or age group or what have you, is a board that needs some work. We're really proud of the diversity work that we do at the board level. I will say for myself, I think I might have been the first racialized person on our board. What I will say is that I'm no longer the only. And that to me is the power of creating those open gates and creating space for more representation. Like I said earlier, representation without that future action is just tokenism. But if it can be the first as a gateway to more and the next and future, I think that is where we start to create that ability to sit with the uncomfortable and then also have the opportunity for folks who are under 30, under 20, wanting to contribute, wanting to see themselves in that future stage of curling. In 20 years, there might not be Michael and I sitting and having these conversations. In fact, probably we won't. But what I would hope that this iteration of our Board of Governors can create is a vision for the future in which those kids who are now down there on the ice see themselves as active participants and contributors.
Great. Wow. Both very powerful statements. Thank you so much for your time.
If you allow me, I just want to add something
Oh, of
to my
course.
statement, and I want to pick up on something Roselle said. I should have said if your clubs are not fully accessible, you've also got work to do, because that's an important part of diversity as well, right? So I apologize for missing that. Roselle, you said something I think was really important, which is, you know, the human condition is that we want to belong, but we also want to contribute. So as we're building community, as we're bringing in non-traditional participants to our sport, we have to make sure we're giving them that opportunity to contribute, right? Because we tend to, as nice people in curling, want to do all the work ourselves, and when we do that, we're doing a disservice to new members.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
No, it's great. Thank you for adding that. And from my perspective as well, this is not easy work. There is lots of challenges. I don't believe that the curling community isn't up to it. But there is lots of specific areas that are very challenging to try to get the full range of our human expression into the facilities and have them all be welcomed and safe and doing what they need to do. So thank you so much. This has been a fascinating conversation. I hope everybody has enjoyed this conversation. If you want to follow up, if there's questions, I'm sure you can reach out and connect with me, and we can follow up with you. But once again, I'll thank Roselle and Michael for your time today, and we can end there.
It's been a pleasure.